Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody, it is Tuesday, March the 18th, 2025. We're going to do things slightly differently today. A young journalist, Andrew Kekia of newsjunkie.net, reached out to me asking for my opinion of the current state of on and offline journalism. So we've reversed seats for this Keen on America show. It will be Andrew Kekia interviewing Andrew Keen. Enjoy.
My name's Andrew Kekia. I'm a writer and a journalist with newsjunkie.net, and we're a news-based internet startup. And we are interested in interviewing you, Andrew, about your tech-informed perspective of the state of the Fourth Estate in the U.S. We're very interested in how the modern media landscape has been obviously so disrupted in the 21st century, both by the internet, but by a bunch of factors. But we want to really dig into it as we build our database of players in the medium ecosystem. So we're getting a non-AI trawled, but actually reporter research database of journalists themselves, newspapers, TV stations, journalism schools, media owners, etc. So again, happy to be on your show to take control and interview you.
Well, thank you, Andrew. So the floor is yours. Ask away.
Fantastic. Well, I guess the biggest picture questions I guess I wanted to throw to you first before we dig into the specifics are, do you think of the Fourth Estate as essentially a civic enterprise, something that is as intrinsic to the function of democracy as any of the checks and balances in the American system?
So maybe you can define what you mean by the Fourth Estate.
Essentially, journalism as the biggest picture enterprise for holding people accountable and expressing the public opinion about how the country is functioning.
So, repeat the question, Andrew, please.
So we're sort of researching this question of, is the Fourth Estate an implied branch of government? Is it a civic enterprise? Is it something that is with a part of the other checks and balances of the actual structure of the U.S. government?
I think it's a consequence of democracy. I wouldn't say it's one, but it's one of the conditions of democracy that you have a free press, so that people, if they choose, have the right to report on the world and say what they like and offer their voices, their video, their audio, their text to tell the world what's happening. So I don't see it as a part of government, but it's certainly a consequence of democracy. I mean, it's quite conceivable, I guess, that you could have a democratic system and no one would want to be a journalist and no one would be interested in knowing about the world. So you can't force people to either produce news or listen to it.
Yeah, well, that's definitely the sort of line of questioning that we were going down. Is it possible to maintain a democracy, or a healthy democracy, I suppose, without journalism?
I think it's a good question, and I guess it depends on what you mean by a healthy democracy. Right. If people don't feel they need to know about the world and are happy not knowing about the world, then I'm not sure it'd be an unhealthy democracy, but it would be a very odd one if people voted. I don't know how they would determine how they voted, or maybe they wouldn't vote at all because they wouldn't be interested in the world. I mean, there are, whatever the numbers are, 40-50% of Americans who don't vote. So presumably they're not that interested in the world. And even the ones who do vote often have very skewed versions of how it works.
Right. Right. And that's what we've sort of been realizing as this research has gone along, is that journalism has partially maybe turned into this elite enterprise, that the kinds of people who are subscribing to the New York Times, for example, are sort of self-selecting to care about the world in a particular kind of way. And it runs sort of contrary to what a lot of journalists espouse their ideals to be, of this like completely accessible version of the truth, that everybody should be informed in a democratic system, that maybe there's a duty to be informed, and that's the only way that, you know, a democracy the size of the United States can function productively. Do you think that those things are at odds with each other at all? Does that push any buttons for you?
I'm not sure you're right on that. I think most journalists, real journalists, professional journalists, know the reality, especially if you work for the New York Times. You know that the people who read you have the luxury of being able to afford the subscription and the luxury of having the time, probably these days the internet access.
Yeah.
But I've always been a defender of elite, so I'm not troubled by that.
Sure.
Some journalists might be. I mean, there are some networks, ProPublica, for example, probably, that would be horrified with the idea of journalism or journalists as any kind of elite. But I've always argued, and not everyone agrees, it's made some of my work quite controversial, that you need journalism as a kind of elite occupation to maintain a thriving democracy. The best is probably the most successful ones America have been when the journalists are the elite, they're trusted and taken seriously and paid properly. And those are the ages where perhaps people were best informed. They certainly weren't perfectly informed. You can look at any period, any newspaper, any medium, and recognize its flaws, its deficiencies. But probably the old world of a top-down media was better informed than today's world of rumor and myth and hysteria on the social networks, where the news, so to speak, is free. I mean, you can get anything you want on Facebook or X, but it's often unreliable, it's biased, sometimes it's just propagandistic. So I don't have a problem with journalism as an elite business, in the same way as I don't have a problem with the law or medicine or engineering or teaching as an elite business. It should reward expertise and talent. And I also don't have a problem with a democracy where the best informed people are probably the most powerful. Doesn't mean that they should have more than one vote, but it does mean that they probably have more impact on the democracy. They probably participate more. They show up at their local school meetings. They might run for office. They might have a role in the political parties. So I don't have a problem with the E word, elite. Some people do.
And that's, I really like that you drew the parallel to the professional class, like the sort of traditional things that people want experts to be, you know, the standard. I've been reading some Walter Lippmann, if you're familiar, with the early sort of turn of the century journalists, post World War I. He really grew his sort of like intellectual legs, and noticed after working on the propaganda board for the Allies, basically this responsibility that he had taken for granted. And so he was one of the first people to directly call for reforming journalism schools to basically be both a requirement for journalists to actually do the work and to be much more rigorous and not just be like, hey, you got to get some context and learn how to be charismatic. But
I tend to think that the best journalists, the really great journalists, tend to be amateurs from, I mean, amateurs in the sense that they didn't go to journalism school or treat it like a trade. Everybody from Hemingway to Orwell, to Hannah Arendt. So I'm not sure you necessarily have to be trained or to go to journalism school to be a great journalist. And I think actually in America, journalism has been excessively, and it's odd, sort of simultaneously excessively professionalized and amateurized, and you have
that's what I was going to ask.
The result is problematic on lots of fronts.
Yeah, it's very much become, obviously there are exceptions, but it seems like the standard mode of operation is for maybe now in the past couple of years it's shifted, but it has been for these like digitizing newspapers to essentially compete with Facebook, to have that like amateurish delivery structure that sort of when you go to the front page of the Wall Street Journal or whatever, it might not look that different from a Facebook feed, or certainly did maybe a few years ago. But now maybe that's changing. Do you think that there is where do you think the public sentiment is on that dichotomy, that amateur versus professionalism setup?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to comment on a public attitude. I don't tend to participate on the network, so I can't comment on the public. What I do know is that when I came out with an unambiguous defense of professional elite media at the end of 2007, I was vilified as an elitist by lots and lots of different people. And today, most of those people, one way or the other, have said to me, actually, you were right. So, and I wasn't completely right. And I don't think I was smarter than everyone else. I just simply said what nobody else wanted to say. So I was the child who made it clear that the emperor wasn't wearing any clothes and no one else was willing to make a fool of themselves or dare to say what was pretty obvious. Not everyone can be a journalist in the same way as not everyone can be an airline pilot or a surgeon or an engineer. It requires, if not training, certainly experience and a degree of expertise. You can't just because you have a camera, a smartphone, everybody has a smartphone now, just because you have a smartphone and you know how to press the play switch or the record switch doesn't make you a journalist. I mean, it does mean that if you happen to be at a place where the police, for example, are murdering a civilian, you can record that, and what you record has significance in terms of the news, but it doesn't make you a journalist. A journalist is someone who's able to conceptualize it and write the story and explain who's involved and provide what at least they think is true about a series of events. So it's hard being a journalist. It requires skill, dedication, training, wisdom, a degree of idealism, I think, as well, as you suggested up front. I mean, it's not the best paid of professions even these days. I mean, even the top people on the New York Times are not that well paid compared to lawyers or doctors or entrepreneurs. So it requires a degree of idealism, of wanting to tell the rest of the world what's happening. And in terms of the relationship with democracy, sometimes that may be true, sometimes it isn't. I mean, you can want to be a really good journalist and not necessarily care that much about democracy. It doesn't make you anti-democratic. It just may not be something that you care about one way or the other. You just want to report on the world.
How would you reconcile that notion of idealism with a sort of expectation to be unbiased? Do you think that those two things naturally come into conflict?
Well, I think inexperienced journalists claim to be unbiased. Any journalist who has any experience or any wisdom or skill knows they're biased, because everyone brings their own baggage of narratives, of expectations, of values to any story. I mean, I've always thought this debate is a bit childish because it's given, it's obvious. And that's the danger of AI. It will promise unbiasedness, but we all know that software is itself biased. So it brings a series of expectations. So for me, I just think we have to get beyond this absurdly unrealistic promise of unbiased information. And whatever you put on a front page means that you're prioritizing that over something else. By choosing to write about one thing over something else, that reflects bias. And all our biases are reflections of ourselves, a bundle of, and we know this, gender and class and race and sexuality and blah, blah, blah. I mean, that stuff's kind of obvious and boring, but it's true as well.
No, I totally see what you're saying. Yeah, there's an inherent bias to time on this, just to your own attention. It's kind of what.
But as I've always said, I mean, the beauty of a traditional newspaper is that those biases were, if not always overt, they were unspoken and understood.
Mm-hmm.
And they still are. So if you go to the Wall Street Journal and you spend any time on the site, you know that their editorial position is pretty conservative and focuses on supporting the free market.
Mm-hmm.
And is generally hostile to the Democratic Party. And the reverse is true with the New York Times. That doesn't mean that the reporting on the Times or the Journal is biased, but it does mean that the editorial is different.
Mm-hmm.
And that produces an unspoken arrangement between the consumer of the news and the giver. Everybody knows that. It doesn't mean it's biased, but it does mean that they prioritize, they have a set of priorities, and you know what you're getting. The problem with social media these days, and that's why I don't really use it very much, and I certainly don't rely on it on news,
Mm-hmm.
is you have no idea where any of this stuff's coming from. Half of it's propaganda, half of it is just made up. Some of it's probably valuable, but you don't know what is valuable and what isn't. And you have no idea, especially if the stuff's anonymous, who's actually producing this stuff. So the beauty of a traditional newspaper, and those are mostly online, whether it's the Times, New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, is that people attach their names to the news. I mean, it's not always true. The Economist doesn't, but The Economist has a very specific take on the world, and their editorial identity is one in which all their articles are designed to sound the same. And we know why and how. Again, they're not playing any games with this.
Right. I think you were getting at exactly one of the other big questions that I had for you, which is this notion of trust. Like this notion that when you go to an outlet, there's a relationship that you almost have with it. There's an understanding of what those biases generally are, an understanding of what the coverage is going to look like, the topics, the tone, whatever it is, the medium itself. And it seems like that overall, in terms of what you were saying, when it used to be this top-down media structure, a lot more people had those trusted relationships with a lot more outlets, or maybe a lot fewer outlets, I guess, overall. But is that something that can be rebuilt with the internet? Like, can people trust the press again in this way? That's what we're trying to figure out. What do you think?
Well, I'm not sure that trust has been done away with. I think anyone who subscribes to the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal or the Economist trusts them. They pay for the news. So I don't think that's been done away with. There's a broader problem, which is the sort of hysteria or paranoia about the world, which exists both on the left and the right. Mm-hmm. In America. I'm not sure how many of those people actually subscribe to newspapers. But I'm guessing that if you do subscribe, if you pay for your news, you trust it. Otherwise, you wouldn't do it. Now, sometimes that trust is justified. Sometimes you're just confirming what you already think. I mean, some people would argue that the trust people have in Fox News is completely unjustified because they basically just have a version of the world which they feed to their audience. A version of the world which is often inaccurate, sometimes just lies. But I think there's still quite a lot of trust. The decline of trust is not so much in media, maybe more in government and institutions.
Well,
that's another issue.
There is data that says that journalism is one of the least trusted it's ever been in history, for the American.
Yeah, I take that, but my guess is that the people who really don't trust journalists are not subscribing to the Times or the Post or the Journal.
That's definitely correct.
And they're getting
Silo.
their news, if they're getting news at all, they're getting it from social networks, or they're getting it from their friends or from their television networks. So in terms of news, I'm not sure. I mean, in a sense, it's in crisis. In a sense, it's very healthy. I mean, in some ways, I'm guessing people trust the media too much. They trust Fox.
Yep.
They trust the New York Times. They should be a little more skeptical.
I definitely
a little more critical in terms of how they digest some of this stuff.
Right. The appreciation of that bias and the way that the information is delivered. But we're curious because speaking on behalf of the News Junkie project, we're very curious about how that sort of siloing off of this information, because like you said, I think it's a perfectly reasonable thing to be like, if you care about this, you pay for it, you engage with it. It's not an obligation necessarily. But if there is this massive distrust in these institutional things and, essentially a lack of belief in the sort of pillars of a democratic government, and nobody's who is making up the vast majority of the population is actually getting any accurate information about it because they're getting all their news from, dubious sources on Facebook or whatever. Isn't that then bad for the health of the country and sort of sets us up for failure as time goes on?
Well, it's not a good situation, but I'm not sure you can blame it on the news media. I mean, the conditions for that is the problem. It's not the news media. The news media is epiphenomenal. It's a consequence of this. So you need to take a couple of steps back and say, okay, well, why is this happening in the first place? Mm-hmm. So the news stuff or the informational issues are consequential. They're not the thing in itself. It's not as if people wake up in the morning and think, I'm really ready to digest information in a fair, objective, thoughtful way, and then their days are always ruined because they come across all this biased news. They choose to digest this stuff. They're habitually subjected to this media of lies and hysteria and nonsense. But they're also, they both produce it and are a product of it. So blaming the news media is absurd. It's blaming them, it's shooting the messenger.
But it does seem like the sort of classic, like authoritarian playbook is to go after the news media first. If it isn't necessarily, as you're saying, an aspect of government itself as important as some, checks and balances level institution, it does seem to be one of, if not the most public institution outside of government that is necessary to take over if you're looking to radically change a society.
Yeah, but that's another issue. That might be happening in America now, but it hasn't happened in the past. It had nothing to do with the internet. People chose to stop subscribing to newspapers. There was a collapse of local newspapers, which wasn't good, which contributed to this. But I'm not sure that may be true, but I'm sure it is true. It's certainly true in Putin's Russia, in China, in Hungary, maybe even in the United States now. But I don't see that as a consequence of social media. That's another story.
So where in your own experience, reading newspapers and being a researcher yourself as you've put these books together, where do you think the importance of journalism really lies? What do you see as journalism in its ideal function to be? Is it just to get the information out there and let the people deal with it?
Well, yeah, I mean, you can't force people to watch C-SPAN. And if you did, you'd have a revolution. That's one way of getting people out on the street, if you force them to watch C-SPAN, which by definition is really boring. And you could watch Congress all day, but it would drive you insane. It would probably drive you more insane than watching Fox News or Rachel Maddow. So if people choose to know about the world, then they're well informed. If they don't, they won't. And in America, it seems as if people are choosing not to, but I'm not sure you can blame journalism for that. There's tons of good newspapers out there. I mean, if you want to know about the world, it's a wonderful time. You can, I mean, that's the beauty of the internet. You can subscribe to these incredible publications for peanuts. I mean, for the price of 4 or 5 Starbucks lattes a month, you can know everything about the world. But people choose not to. It's not their priority. You can't force them to. I mean, even if you made it free, people wouldn't look at it. I mean, even if the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal were free, the vast majority of people wouldn't read them because they've got, in their mind at least, other things to do, better things to do. So you can't force people to be civically minded.
Do you think they should?
I mean, there are things you can do in terms of democracy. For example, in Australia, it's illegal not to vote. Now, that's another issue. So you could make it illegal not to vote, and you could punish people for not voting. And as a consequence, perhaps people would want to inform themselves more. But I'm guessing in America, people would just vote. They'd probably do it digitally, electronically, it wouldn't necessarily encourage them to subscribe to the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal.
So do you think they should do these kind of things? Like, should the public be more informed? Should it be obligated to vote? Like, where do you
should? You mean, am I saying that someone should spend more time reading about the world? I'm not. It's not for me to say. If they choose not to, it's their problem. You can't force people to do it. You can. Again, I mean, you can create education systems designed to make people curious about the world. That's a good thing. You can encourage civic leaders of one kind or another, whether they're union leaders or churchmen or local government people, to encourage people to know about the world. But you can't force people to do it. I mean, I guess you could. It would be a very odd kind of dictatorship. I'm sure there have been some dystopias written by Asimov or someone else who imagined a world where everyone had to know about the world. But the vast majority of Americans anyway, I mean, there's a whole tradition of writing about this from, I mean, you mentioned Lippmann, but from Daniel Bell onwards and many other cultural and social critics, Neil Postman in particular comes to mind, who have observed how in American culture, news and entertainment have been collapsed. So they're the same thing, which is what has happened with Trump, in my view. You've had the complete collapse of politics and entertainment. So politics and reality television have actually become the same thing. And we have a reality television president who every 20 minutes tweets about raising tariff prices or not raising tariff prices or accusing his enemies of something absurd. So that's what's happened. I mean, I don't celebrate those things, but I don't know how you can make them illegal.
Sure. Then is it a cultural question of, so assuming that those are like bad things net for society, that if you're in a democratic system, you'd want to untangle that collapse, which I totally agree has happened. At least traditionally, it seems like the press has been a pretty healthy counterweight to when that kind of stuff happens. Like when you wrote about Teddy Roosevelt in your most recent book, he was a huge, essentially manipulator of the press, often for good, but eventually they kind of turned on him and were like, no, you're doing things wrong. You're doing things wrong. Like, we're not going to just let you do this. But that turn doesn't really seem to be happening, since there is that symbiotic collapse of all these economies.
Well, it has. I mean, the thing with Trump is it has happened. It happened, and that's why the press is increasingly irrelevant in the US, at least. The Wall Street Journal, which is a conservative newspaper, has always been, at best, ambivalent about Trump, usually very critical, and it's increasingly critical, certainly, of his economic policies. The Times, the Post, the LA Times, they've all been incredibly overtly hostile, and it doesn't make any difference. So I'm not sure the press matters when it comes to this new reality.
Yeah.
And I don't know how you change it. So I mean, I would like an arrangement where people don't treat politics as if it's reality television.
Yeah, maybe. So you think it is this?
But unless you have a vast kind of cultural change, I don't know how you do away with that.
Yeah. Do you?
And that's why all these civic online news initiatives, to me, have always. I mean, you're just preaching to the converted. It's a tiny group of people feeding another tiny group of people, telling them what they want to hear and what they want to do, which is fine, but it's just irrelevant in a broader sense.
That's a pretty good quote, though, because the nonprofit news was the biggest recent sort of promised salvation for the industry on that front. You don't think that that's a sustainable solution?
You're cutting out a bit, Andrew. Say that again.
Oh, well, I was picking up on the nonprofit news thing, because that was definitely the sort of most recent messiah moment to try and fix the news industry, was like this notion of nonprofit news. You don't think that that's a sustainable
Well, there's
solution?
always been, I mean, ever since I've been writing about this stuff, which is more than 20 years now, there's always been this promise of nonprofits. There's always been these startups that offer to solve the problem, and they never even come close.
Mm-hmm.
Because the vast majority of people don't read them. They're not interested. I mean, one of the crises is the collapse of local news. Craig Newmark understood this. That's why he's, the founder of Craigslist. He understood that one of the unintended consequences of Craigslist, which was one of the early disintermediators of traditional news, was the destruction of local newspapers, because people weren't going to pay for advertising in it, which was what enabled them as businesses. But it's an unintended consequence, and I don't know what once, to whatever cliche you want to use, once the Pandora's box is open, there's not a lot you can do.
Yeah. Do you read local news?
No, I never have. I've never been particularly interested, partially because I'm now sort of naturally the kind of person very much involved in my local community, and partially because I find it boring.
Yeah, I worked for a local newspaper for a few years. It was also a nonprofit, and it was very interesting because it seemed like the community was either like super excited about the fact that there was this thing that was providing this solution exactly to like the death of all this local media, and wow, it's so incredible that you're going to these government meetings. And then you would, report on the government meetings, and they're like, oh wow, this really sucks. Like, we actually don't want to read about this. Like, not super interesting. And that seems
I mean, look, the first part of the 19th century, of course, Tocqueville came here, and I don't know how accurate his vision of America or his version of America was, but he presented Americans as being deeply interested in local news and participating, which is an ideal which may have once existed, but it no longer exists.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Then what about some of these other big, sort of hyped solutions to this quote unquote problem? You're saying it's not a problem, but a lot of people seem to, of, like maybe bloggers on Substack or individual TikTokers giving the news to young people. Do you think that there's any promise in that kind of personality driven journalism?
I mean, I think Substack's good. I'm on it myself. I hope people who watch this follow me on Substack. So what Substack's doing is enabling independent journalists to make a living. The problem is it tends to be, and I've always warned about this, a winner-take-all economy, where a tiny group of Substackers do very well, the Andrew Sullivans of the world. Mm-hmm. And there isn't much of a middle class, and everyone else is just giving their stuff away for free. I think there's some value on TikTok and the other video platforms, but mostly it's distorts reality, and mostly it's oversimplistic attempts to make sense of reality. It's news for lazy people. I mean, you can't have news in 15-second segments of video. It's just not possible.
Yeah, and that definitely falls into your cult of the amateur point from the original book there.
Yeah, I mean, look, the cult of the amateur was part of a tradition. I mentioned Postman earlier. Lots of people are part of that tradition. I'm just one more book in it. But it does speak to the increasing inanity of culture. You can't blame newspapers for that. And newspapers are serious endeavors. I mean, maybe one of the problems with high-end American newspapers is they're a little too serious. The New York Times never has a funny section. It takes itself very seriously, and it takes the world seriously. And there are a small group of people who agree with it and pay for it, but most people don't. Well, there's no middle ground between the high church of the New York Times and the low populist church of TikTok. You need something in between, and it doesn't exist.
Sure. On that front, though, I always do bring up that I think they get like some absurd number of subscribers just for like the crossword and Wordle and stuff. So that's their almost
which is a good thing. I mean, if you can get people to know, it's a good point. And I'm not sure. I mean, New York Times has done a great job with its podcasts, with its word games, with its cookery, with its lifestyle products. Now, some people are a bit critical of that. They look down on it. But if that's bringing people in the door and getting them to pay for their news, and one consequence is that they're all also reading the harder news stories, the longer news stories, the more substantial ones that require time, then that's a good thing. I mean, the Times does also very good long-form journalism. The magazine is excellent. I'm interviewing later this week Daniel Oppenheimer. He wrote a piece about his own experience in marriage counseling, which I thought was excellent. It was long and substantial and extremely engaging.
Interesting. I guess I'm just sort of intrigued by your almost like comfort with this idea of that it's like it's okay that is just for a small group of people and that's all who it's going to be for. Like that there's no sense that should be something that, you know, obviously like
I'm not celebrating it. I'm just in the same way as when King Canute stood on the beach and made it clear that the tide came in. It didn't mean that he was necessarily saying that was a good thing. I'm just pointing out a reality.
Sure,
and it's not going to change. And anyone who thinks it will substantially is wrong. Sure. It might, I mean, maybe it's conceivable that if this Trump fiasco, for example, ends up with a real disaster, you know, a nuclear war or the complete collapse of the economy, which is conceivable given how irresponsible and selfish and dumb he is, then the next generation of people might think to themselves, well, we asked for this by treating Trump like a reality television star, and we need serious politicians. And if we want serious politicians, we need a serious media. And if we have a serious media, we need a serious citizenry. But at the moment, none of that stuff. I mean, there is a serious media for a small proportion of people, but the vast majority of Americans just aren't serious. They don't view politics as a serious thing. It's just reality television. And that's what Trump is delivering, and that's why he's popular. He's delivering it as if it's serialized television. So whether it's serialized real-time social media or more episodic television, he sort of goes between the two. He seems comfortable with both. But that's how people think of it, that he says something. Oh, did you hear what Trump said today or last minute or this and that? And it's the same way as they watch stuff on the networks.
So do you think that it was absent this
I mean, you see it even in the more serious media. I mean, all this stuff on Netflix, these series. I mean, who watches hours and hours of series? But people do. Right. They must do because they exist. They're valuable companies.
Yeah. So
absolutely. People are addicted to narrative form. And most people's intuitive narrative form is derived, I think, from either reality television or just mainstream television, and they just take it for granted that that's what politics is, which is why for them, Trump is a natural politician, and for an old class and a journalist class, he isn't, because he doesn't know what he's talking about, and he just makes stuff up.
Do you think that then the seal is broken? Like, is that the way that politics is inevitably going to continue, bar a catastrophe like you mentioned?
I mean, I'm worried to talk of anything about inevitability. I mean, if we'd have had this conversation 10 years ago and you'd have asked me about Trump, I would have said, that's not likely. That's not going to happen. That's absurd. And I would have been wrong, and practically everybody else would have been wrong. Very, very few people could understand.
So you're good at making predictions. That's sort of your thing.
Well, exactly. If I'm good at making predictions, and I had no idea. And I remember people even asking me in 2014 or 15, can Trump run? Can he win? I said, absolutely not. So I didn't know. Now it seems obvious. Now it makes sense. So I don't know what's going to happen in the future. It's hard to, the one thing I would say is it's hard to imagine things becoming either more inane, more distasteful, or potentially more disastrous. I mean, at a certain point, the system's going to break. At a certain point, this is not, it's not a sort of infinitely elastic system that can put up with such absurdity, such irresponsibility. So at a certain point, if you have a president who rules by kind of social media fiat, either he will wreck the country, he will drive the car into a ditch, or he'll create some sort of dictatorship, which I don't think is particularly likely, which would result perhaps in the military getting involved or civil war. So something has to happen. This can't go on infinitely. I mean, at a certain point, you hit the bottom of the well. You can't just keep on falling.
Yeah.
What I'm not going to tell you is when. I have no idea. I don't have any more idea than anyone else. But at a certain point, this thing cannot continue forever.
Yeah.
I mean, Trump seems absurd and all the rest of it. I mean, it's conceivable, I guess. People used to talk about the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine being evil. And then Hamas came along, and mainstream Palestinian opposition to some people now seems quite acceptable and mainstream. And who knows, after Hamas, you may get a version of ISIS. But at a certain point, this is not Moore's law. It's not just infinite.
Right.
You can't just keep on splitting the stupidity and getting more stupidity. It's just not conceivable. There are laws of, I don't know if they're laws of physics, but they're laws of the world which suggest that this will not go on forever.
Yeah. Do you look to history at all to find any sort of comfort?
Well, you can look to history. I mean, people compare what's happening now with the rise of fascism. I'm not sure that's always helpful. Sometimes it is. And of course, what came out of fascism was the catastrophe of war, which set people straight for a while.
Mm-hmm. I'm
not sure that's helpful. Probably the better equivalents of what happened at the later stage of the Roman Empire, this, especially in America, this degeneration, the shift from democracy to empire, and the kinds of emperors, some of whom were insane, many of which were destructive and hated, who came along. So I think that's a better comparison. There are historical. It's good. The more history you know, the more helpful it can be. But if you want to find a historical replication, that's wrong, and that also reflects the fact that you don't understand history. because nothing ever is repeated identically. There's always shades of repetition, and you can become wiser. I mean, my background is a historian, so I think that a good knowledge of history makes you wiser about the world, but it certainly doesn't guarantee that you know what's going to happen next. Although I will say that most good futurists are also good historians.
Yeah. I know you would probably know better than me, also as a Brit yourself, but wasn't Cromwell like an obsessive student of history? Like, and he was really terrified of people hating him?
I'm not a Cromwell expert, probably, although he was, I wouldn't say the Donald Trump of his age, but he was certainly no Democrat. And I don't know what his attitude was to a free press. I mean, he established a very bloody dictatorship, a short-lived dictatorship. So lots of people were punished, imprisoned, tortured, executed for telling the truth. So I'm not sure we want to replicate Cromwell's England.
Of course. Are you, so you're not, do you think that these sort of comparisons to the rise of fascism aren't necessarily helpful? And I think that's definitely fair, but do you think that there is how risky is the authoritarian swing? Do you think it's like...
Yeah, I mean, it's very troubling on lots of levels, but it's not a return to fascism, I don't think. Although I did a show earlier this week where I think the MAGA's sort of brutal bullying of the trans community, that is in some ways fascist. But the Nazis in particular were bent on obliterating groups of people and perpetual war. I don't think that's true. So I'm not sure it's particularly helpful.
Well, then I guess as the time's sort of running out, I wanted to ask you a little bit more on the future, since I just finished reading How to Fix the Future, and you ended with this call to the children. Do you see the digital natives? I myself, I'm 24, was raised in this kind of media environment, this narrative environment that I think you said very well, people being addicted to narrative form. Do you think that can be harnessed for good? Do you think that can be pointed in a positive direction, that social change can solve some of these big picture problems we've been talking about?
I think so. I'm cautiously optimistic about your generation. I think you've got a bad deal from my generation on lots of fronts. And now there's all this kind of moral hysteria about being addicted to the internet. And people like Jonathan Haidt calling for media bans, and Australia banning social media. I'm not sure any of that's particularly helpful. Also, this hysteria about young men, about them being Trump supporters and about them being unhappy. I mean, some of the data is concerning about loneliness and self-harm and educational achievements. But yeah, I am cautiously optimistic about the vitality of particularly young people in America to make the world ultimately a better place. I mean, it's different from what you've been talking about. I don't think your generation is going to save journalism. I don't think suddenly in 20 years, when your generation comes to power, that suddenly everyone's going to be reading the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal and becoming a responsible citizen. But I do think your generation has been written off and infantilized. And I also think there's a kind of gerontocratic quality now to America where the old people need to be got rid of, whether it's, I mean, we saw it with Biden and Pelosi. We're seeing it now with Schumer. We're seeing it with Trump, although he has a kind of unnatural youthfulness about himself. Yeah. But the baton of power has not been passed on. That's another problem. And I think that I mean, let me reverse. I mean, do you think you know about the world? How do you keep up? You're working for a new startup. Where do you learn about the nature of things? Do you feel you're as well informed as your parents or your grandparents' generation?
I certainly think so. And I think that it is expanded by understanding both the traditional and the new forms of getting that information. You know, the media literacy of being able to understand where a bias comes from and how someone types a tweet or makes a TikTok is as important as a trusting relationship and what the New York Times is going to publish. And I'm intrigued by like natural media literacy that's been developed by a lot of kids on these social media platforms. If you could apply that to longer form, better researched, quality, more typical journalism, as we're talking about it, I think that they're actually sort of primed to be able to handle that kind of thing. You see some digital creators on like YouTube and Substack getting some attention for exactly that kind of stuff. I'm not a
Yeah, and you're seeing influences on. I mean, I think that there was a problem with the universities and the media being too controlled from the left, from liberals.
Yeah.
You're seeing young people push back against that, and I think that's healthy.
Mhm.
I'm not sure it's necessarily healthy that they're voting for Trump, but it is healthy that they're simply not repeating what their parents have said or what their parents' media says, and are questioning everything. And then there's good reason to do that. And in some ways, our moment today in the 2020s isn't that different from the 60s.
Mhm.
It's just that the generational revolt is harder to make sense of. It's not as formalized, but in some ways, I think it's just as significant.
Mhm. I completely agree. I completely agree on all that. And it's interesting to be a young journalist in that time, because I think that there is opportunity in the industry, and I think that there's an appetite for what the promise of journalism is, though I certainly agree with a lot of your critiques. So that's the project that I'm undertaking with this kind of research, is figuring out where those lines are and talk to people like you.
But I think it's good. I mean, I think if there were more young people like you, we'd be in a much better situation. But you just can't fall into the sort of utopian trap of imagining that you're going to change everything overnight. That's not going to happen, and you probably won't change that much. But it doesn't necessarily matter.
Right. It's the classic confusion of the importance of your own medium. But I think there's something. So I don't want to take up too much of your time, and then we're pushing the hour, but I think you've dispensed some good wisdom here. So I appreciate you parsing through a lot of this.
Good. Well, I'll run this. We'll have to do a bit of editing, but I'll run it on my show. So hopefully people will find it interesting. And thank you, Andrew, for the questions. Good questions. Unfortunately, the weird thing is that nothing's changed over 20 years. When I published Cult of the Amateur back
that's what I was so
2007.
So I read.
It's the same stuff, the same argument. Nothing's changed.
Exactly. I read 3 of your 4 books, and I was like, especially when I started with Cult of the Amateur, I was like, this is almost such like a truism that it's like absurd. Like, obviously there are elements that have like felt dated, but I was like, oh yeah, of course. Like, if you pollute in the industry with like 1 million amateurs, like it's going to get worse. Or like your critique of the internet is sort of common knowledge for my generation, to be like, yeah, of course Silicon Valley was wrong about a bunch of stuff, and then it produced a bunch of like egomaniacal billionaires who are making society worse. Like, it's sort of absurd to me that people didn't notice that at the time.
Yeah, I mean, the scary thing about my books is all the critiques were right and all the solutions were wrong. So I don't know whether that's just me or whether it's always easy to criticize. It's always incredibly hard to come up with solutions.
Yeah.
And most of the books, all the classics from Postman onwards up to Nick Carr, they've always been very good at observing what's wrong, and they've always been either weak or not even willing to take on how to fix this.
Yes.
But the good news is that it does kind of get fixed.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm guessing when Postman was writing in the 60s, he thought things couldn't get much worse. I mean, he wrote in 89, Amusing Ourselves to Death.
Yeah.
84, sorry, he wrote Amusing Ourselves to Death, saying, we got it wrong. It wasn't Orwell, it was Huxley. I don't suppose he could imagine anything could have got much worse. And of course, since 84, things have got at least in a post-man sense, a lot worse. So we still have a lot. But as I said, it can't get. I would be amazed if things got a lot worse, and we can still have this conversation or survive. Who knows?
Yeah, I think you're.
But we will see.
Yes, we will. It's an exciting time to be alive, if nothing else.
Good, Andrew. Well, good luck with your thing. I'm going to run it. Thank you for the time and the good questions, and best of luck with your enterprise. Keep in touch.
Thank you very much. Good to talk to you, Andrew.
Can I step on the scene? I'm ready to attack. Andrew Keene. Yeah, he's the one to bash. Asking questions, no filter, just keeps on grinning. He's the man who's got the whole crowd spinning. Money, fame, success, it's all in his sight. He'll dig deep, expose you with all his might. No sugarcoating, he'll cut right through. Andrew Keene, he's the one to spew. Yeah, he's an expert.